Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Great Evidence to Decision Frameworks Experience and Use for Guideline Adaptation and Adoption conference call hosted by Dr. Holger Schunemann. My name is Gyula, and I am your event manager. During the presentation, your lines will remain on listen only. If you require assistance at any time, please key *0 on your telephone, and a coordinator will be happy to assist you. I would like to advise all parties this conference is being recorded. And now, I would like to hand over to Dr. Holger Schunemann. Please proceed.
Thank you very much for coming to the conference. I welcome everybody to this webinar. The title of the webinar is obviously on the first slide, and you've signed up for it. It's a real pleasure to do this webinar on behalf of the GIN Board of Trustees, and I would like to advise you that I'm sharing my video. If your connection is slow, you might want to alert me to that. I can turn that off, although it may be helpful to actually see me speak. You can also obviously turn off that little window there. I have a slide presentation prepared, a narrated slide presentation, but we would like to encourage you to ask questions as they come up. You can type these questions obviously in the chat room, and we might address questions, as I said, as they are appearing, or collect them for later for the Q&A session that we have reserved at the end of the webinar. But I will get started with without much further ado. So today's webinar is given from McMaster University. These are the groups that I represent, the McMaster Grade Center, Cochrane Canada, which is located at McMaster, and obviously the Guideline International Network Board of Trustees. Just for those of you who are not familiar with where I'm located, this is obviously a map of the world, and we are located in North America, around the Toronto area. Hamilton is right there, it's close to Niagara Falls, close to Toronto. Our department was founded by Dave Sackett. We are widely considered the birthplace of evidence-based medicine and problem-based learning. And if you would like to know more about me or the department, please go to the website. You can Google us very easily and we'll find information about us. We are housing a fairly large department with 250 graduate students. Many of them focus on the type of work that we will be presenting here. These are my disclosures. I co-chair the GREAT working group, have worked with a number of WHO committees, and that is relevant for some of the work that I will be presenting. I'm on the Cochrane steering group, and most importantly, this is a GIN webinar. I'm a board of directors member. I don't have any direct financial conflict of interest. I will not be paid for this webinar, and I would like to acknowledge in particular two people who have worked on the evidence to decision framework intensely with some other great colleagues, obviously Andy Oxman and Pablo Alonso. Today's presentation will focus on guidelines and the context of great evidence to decision frameworks. EtD is the abbreviation that we will be using. I will speak about some of the background and the development of the EtDs. They are a new development, as I will say later, a result of a 5-year project that GREAT had kicked off. I will talk about the use and application of EtDs, and then using GREAT evidence to decision frameworks for what we call adolopment, a short term for adoption, adaptation, and de novo creation of recommendations. And just in terms of the brief background for us, most of you will be familiar with the work of the GREAT working group, and that group obviously focused on developing a unifying, transparent, and sensible system for grading the quality of evidence and developing recommendations in healthcare guidelines. Over 90 organizations adopted or used GREAT worldwide. These are some of the organizations that actually use GREAT on this particular slide. And today, we will focus on one aspect of GRADE work of the GRADE working group. As you know, GRADE has primarily dealt with two issues, already mentioned it, assessing the certainty, or what we also call quality of evidence or confidence in the estimates, which involves assessing evidence transparently, determining, as I said, the confidence in an estimate of an effect or an association, starts with a single study and ends with the body of evidence by outcome and a recommendation. These recommendations, that's the second part of GRADE's work, obviously focus on developing very structured healthcare recommendations. It involves making judgments and decisions of the guideline panel transparent. We use evidence-to-decision frameworks, formerly called evidence-to-decision tables, which include a comprehensive list of criteria that influence a guideline recommendation and ends with a clearly developed and formulated message for action, either a strong or conditional, weak, qualified recommendation. These are just alternative terms, so conditional, weak, or qualified recommendations. And those are made typically for or against an option that a guideline panel has considered. And today, as I said, we will focus on the second aspect in the context of adopting, adapting, or de novo creation of guidelines. That's the general overview. I will start with one example to provide a little bit of the history of these evidence-to-decision frameworks. This is from a guideline that we produced approximately 10 years ago, and it's a widely known example looking at pharmacological treatments for what about 10 years ago was a health threat, influenza H5N1 virus. You can read about this work in two publications that came out around that time. And one of the recommendations would have been in patients with confirmed or strongly suspected infection with avian influenza A virus, clinicians should administer also oseltamivir treatment as soon as possible. There was strong recommendation based on very low quality evidence. But how did we get there? We, at that time, reviewed the evidence that was available. There were 4 systematic reviews summarizing 5 randomized controlled trials of oseltamivir in seasonal influenza. We provided effect estimates. That is really not the focus of today's presentation. There were published case series. There was in vitro and animal research. There was no promising alternative in terms of pharmacological management at that time. A very deadly condition, between 50 and 80% of infected individuals died, and the cost was relatively low, 40 euro, about $50 US per treatment course. We realized that these recommendations would require transparent judgments for the world, and used something that we called at that time evidence-to-decision tables, which is the prototype of our evidence-to-decision frameworks. And I'm just reviewing this relatively briefly with you. In these tables, we would record judgments that the panel, which was put together at the time, made. And these judgments were recorded on 5 different criteria. Some overlap between them: lower quality evidence, a judgment here, and an explanation for why the panel made the judgment in that very right-hand column. And the criteria, not of great relevance today, because I will go into details for how we look at it in the new evidence-to-decision framework, were evaluated sequentially, achieving consensus with the guideline panel on each of the judgments to end up with the recommendation that I already showed you. We then continue to further develop these evidence-to-decision frameworks. This is a more elaborated version from a paper by Nancy Santeso that summarizes or was produced for another set of World Health Organization guidelines, in this case dealing with treatment of cervical intraepithelial neoplasia. And what we did here was we tried to make, once again, the decisions and the explanations transparent for those who would use recommendations, again, focusing on what the underlying evidence was, whether or not there was certainty about the balance between the benefits and harms, and provided brief signaling questions, a panel would then, and explanations, a panel would then make a decision about this, provide an explanation, and a more detailed explanation, as well as some additional considerations on largely 4 factors that included, beyond the certainty in the evidence and the balance of benefits and harms, a certainty or judgment about the underlying values and preferences and resource implications to end up with a recommendation, once again, based on judgments and explanations. So this is all the background work that we used to start develop, or some of the background work that we used to start developing the evidence to decision frameworks. And we did that because we did notice certain shortcomings. While these evidence to decision tables were transparent for decision making, they certainly were transparent for decision making because they let us record our judgment. They had limitations, as I said. They were not granular enough. I'll give you a quick example. So in particular, in large-scale international guidelines, issues around the feasibility and acceptability related to options or interventions were not sufficiently recorded, although clearly feasibility and acceptability is related to underlying values and preferences of certain of the general population or the society. They were not, as I said, separately recorded in the evidence to decision tables. So we felt they were not granular enough, not detailed enough. Furthermore, it became clear that different decisions or recommendations need adaptable framework. And for instance, coverage decisions, health systems decisions, or the use of tests required adaptable framework. So GRADE's DECIDE project, which ran from 2011 through 2015, was an EU-funded project that focused, amongst other things, on improving these evidence to decision tables. And the methods for development are either just published or soon to be published. Watch out for publications, first authored by Pablo Alonso, as well as many of us as co-authors that should be coming out very shortly. The development was an iterative process. It started obviously with the EtD approach that the GRADE Working Group had put together for its tables. It included a review of relevant literature. It included brainstorming. It included feedback from relevant stakeholders, application to examples. Over 25 guidelines were actually developed iteratively with different versions of the evidence to decision frameworks. I will explain or use some of them as examples today, and then obviously user testing as part of the original guideline development or in a one-on-one setting to make sure that the things that we did actually made sense. The evidence to decision frameworks are separated into 3 general areas. First, they include details about the question that the guideline panel asked. That includes what specific subgroups might have to be considered. So thinking back to the avian influenza example, a typical subgroup would be, should there be something different in children? Should a recommendation differ for people of younger age? And then obviously relevant background information that a panel needs to know in order to make informed recommendations. The second general section is the assessment section. It includes the criteria that influence the direction and strength of a recommendation and decision. It includes judgments, research evidence, and additional considerations, which also here I will go through in greater detail. And then finally, it ends with conclusions. It includes the type of recommendation that is made, the actual recommendation, a justification for this recommendation, issues around implementation, monitoring and evaluation, as well as research considerations that may come up. So, oops, I'm sorry. I will start and focus today on the actual assessment and then later speak about the influence on recommendation. So what are we doing as a guideline panel? Just as a explanation, this is a screenshot from GradePro, Grade's application to produce recommendations. And this is a general screenshot of an decision framework within GradePro with as I mentioned, criteria, judgments, research evidence, and additional considerations mentioned. Here would be, for instance, one of the first criteria, how important the actual problem is that we are dealing with. I will go through the entire list with you of the criteria that are relevant for the EtD framework. So it is separated into criteria on which a recommendation is based, the judgments that must be made in relation to each criterion, the research evidence to inform each judgment, and any additional considerations that inform or explain each of the judgments. Just as an example here, whether or not the problem is a priority in the context of multi-drug resistant TB, an additional consideration may have been that while there's a certain prevalence in adults, in children with TB, MDR may be less frequent, and that this is not supported by research evidence, and it's a judgment or potential consideration by a panel, which at the end will lead to, obviously, research gaps to be identified. So great evidence to decision frameworks can help guideline panels and decision makers move from evidence to a recommendation or a decision by informing each judgment about the pros and cons of each of the options, considering each important factor that determine a decision, providing a concise summary of the best available research evidence to inform judgment, helping to structure discussion and identify reasons for disagreement, and making the basis for decision transparent and adaptable for target audiences. Ergo, the second part of this presentation, focusing on adaptation, adoption, and de novo development. But once again, so what are we doing as guideline panels? I suspect many of you are guideline developers who've joined us today. We are focusing on discussing research evidence that should be identified through systematic reviews that inform a particular question. We are adding relevant additional considerations, as I described in a previous slide, and then at the end make judgments when the research evidence is complete. These judgments are often made by those who do not have important conflicts of interest related to a specific recommendation. The presentation and use of the actual criteria that influence a decision or recommendation can be tailored in what we call interactive evidence to decision frameworks. Once again, the interactive EtDs let us choose the criteria that would influence the direction and strength of a recommendation. So for instance, if it is very obvious that a problem, a healthcare problem, is a priority because that's why you have convened a guideline panel and the prevalence of a condition and its importance is high, you might not, for every single recommendation with a guideline panel, reconsider that particular item over and over again. Therefore, you would possibly omit it. There are other issues. Many of you as guideline panels will not consider cost effectiveness when you are making recommendations. Most people would say you should, but some guideline panels simply don't do it. Under those circumstances, cost or resource utilization could be avoided as part of the interactive evidence to decision framework. The evidence to decision frameworks are currently available in Epistemonicus, and they're available in GradePro, as I said, which was one of the main targets or goals of the Grade Decide project, to integrate them in GradePro, Grade software. So just to explain what I just said in terms of selecting individual criteria for an assessment of the evidence, I just wanted to explain this a bit further. So this would be the interactive surface or interface rather, where you could unclick that with every panel recommendation, you would want to discuss with the panel whether or not the problem, the condition that you're dealing with, is an actual priority. Or, as I mentioned before, you might want to unclick whether or not resources should be considered and how certain you are in the evidence around resources or cost-effectiveness considerations. Under those circumstances, it would not appear as part of the evidence-to-decision framework. So I would like to move to, before going through a few additional features of the evidence-to-decision framework, to the use of EtDs in real guidelines and the associated user testing. So it's been used in several WHO guidelines, in an American Thoracic Society IPF, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis guideline, with a number of recommendations, obviously, in a large collaboration with the Ministry of Health in Saudi Arabia with over 230 recommendations, the World Allergy Organization in 3 guidelines with 10 recommendations. This is obviously an incomplete list. Many of my colleagues have used it elsewhere. But one of the advantages or prevailing features of the interactive evidence decision frameworks is that they can be used during the guideline development process. And I will demonstrate how this actually can be done. So first of all, the EtDs are shared usually on a large screen or on a screen with the panel evaluating information that is on the screen. These EtDs in the panel meeting are, as I said, presented, but they can also be shared online with panel members before the meeting. And in fact, that fulfills many, many purposes. The purposes include that it helps clarifying the process to panel members of what is requested or required of them. During the preparation of the information, the research evidence that is included in the evidence-to-decision frameworks, it can be shared to obtain input on the actual evidence. Although you might have conducted or you should have conducted systematic reviews, it is often important to vet that information, that research evidence, with panel members. And that can be done depending on what the methods of your organization or what the framework of your organization is. That can be done with conflicted members in a format that they would not influence judgments but have an opportunity to ensure that they are included in the research evidence identification process. So the research evidence column could be shared with them. For initial agreement, for instance, on the included evidence in that context and obtaining information about additional considerations. If possible, feasible, and appropriate, they can be shared for agreement on judgments for specific decision criteria. That often facilitates and speeds up the process in a way that you wouldn't have to discuss all of the details necessarily at the actual panel meeting. However, all of that may happen at the panel meeting, at an in-person meeting, so you can evaluate initial agreement either by sharing it or doing it at the actual meeting. And then the live use is preempted by, or preceded rather, by sending or sharing a final draft of the evidence-to-decision frameworks before a final meeting takes place. So once again, just to show you some more information for how this can be done, or show you some examples for how this can be done. This is from an upcoming guideline on what is called a rare disease on catastrophic antiphospholipids syndrome. So these evidence-to-decision frameworks have and will be used in rare conditions and are in particular helpful there. A panel preparation may include that those who prepare the evidence to decision frameworks provide the research evidence, start with initial judgments that obviously would, for the most part, look at don't know, as if one wouldn't know, in order to then go with the panel through the information. Additional considerations can be included, and the research evidence supporting, for instance, any anticipated desirable effects would be presented. The research evidence about the interventions is typically supported by summary of findings tables. So, for instance, here, the summary of findings table includes, these are well known, obviously, the actual outcomes that are considered for a decision, with the number of studies described, the effect measures both in relative as well as in absolute terms, and an overall certainty rating. This is a rare disease with few studies. In this case, it's very low certainty in the evidence. This would be, in addition to the research evidence supporting benefits and harms, as I mentioned, information about resource requirements and costs would be included. That can be done by setting, by country, and would be included under research evidence. Then a description of how certain one would be in the evidence about resources, and so on. Other criteria that are not showing here on these screenshots include considerations around feasibility, acceptability, and equity in order to then arrive at a recommendation. And the recommendation section would typically look at Grade's framework for making either strong recommendations against, conditional recommendation against an intervention, or strong or conditional recommendations for an intervention, or if both alternatives are viable, a conditional recommendation for either the intervention or the comparison. And for guideline panel preparation, we typically start with straw recommendations that the panel can then review at the actual meeting. A straw recommendation would identify the population already, the intervention, but would leave open whether or not it is a weak or strong recommendation, either in favor or against. Other relevant criteria that come out of the panel meeting would be issues around why a certain recommendation would be made, called justification, subgroup considerations that I mentioned earlier, as well as what might have to be considered for implementation. To show you a particular example for how this might look with a real recommendation, a conditional recommendation for an intervention may be made. The panel would formulate that actual recommendation. It would provide additional information that might be relevant for implementing or that should be seen by those looking at the recommendation, for instance, informed decision-making process, and then justifications can be given here. For instance, a 2.5 times higher probability of being cured than dying with the intervention could be used as a justification. Moving on, other sections of the actual recommendation or conclusion section have to do with, as I said, implementation considerations. So what should be done in order to implement the option, issues around monitoring and evaluation. So for instance, pharmacovigilance for a medication that comes with side effects should be considered. And what the evidence to decision frameworks really support, and very well support, is the identification of research priorities. Following a detailed process of going through the evidence to decision frameworks allows the identification of individual gaps in the research. That may relate to issues around how large the intervention effect is, but they may also relate to issues around patients' values and preferences if there is no information, or issues around resource implications and better research on what the associated cost of an intervention may be. I will stop here, pause here for 1 second, and see if there are any questions in the interim that we might want to answer. I will ask the moderator if there are any questions in the chat room.
Thank you. Currently, we don't have any questions. Ladies and gentlemen, if you wish to ask a WebEx question, then just simply click on the Q&A tab indicated by a question mark sign, type your question, and click Send to all panelists.
And if there are any questions that panelists, the audience might want to ask verbally, that could be done as well. I'll just take a second. Okay, there may be no questions for the time being, and that will allow me to move on and move to the second part of our presentation today. Okay. So what does all of that mean? This is and how can that be? How can the evidence to decision frameworks be used for, as we said, development? I'll provide you with a very quick example for when recommendations need local adaptation and adoption. So this is from the guideline that I mentioned a little bit earlier, a World Health Organization guideline on the use of cryotherapy, which is cold therapy, or eliminating lesions that may turn into cervical cancer, so for cervical intraepithelial neoplasia. And that recommendation at WHO would have, one recommendation at WHO would have looked as follows. In settings where a certain surgical technique, loop excision, is available and accessible, the expert panel suggests treatment with LEAP over this cold therapy. It's a conditional recommendation based on moderate quality evidence. And the conditional recommendation obviously means a few things, that the factors that should be fulfilled before a recommendation is implemented should be met. One of them is that LEAP needs to be available. That is, the intervention needs to be feasible and accessible. So how can a guideline panel under those circumstances adapt the recommendation? And I'll go back a little bit into the history for how this type of adaptation to local circumstances can be done. There were, at WHO, about 12 years ago, there was an effort to review what would help the what would support adaptation of guidelines developed at WHO. And back then, we produced a fairly brief checklist for identifying guidelines that would require adaptation. So for instance, is there important variation in the need, higher prevalence or baseline risk, or is the health status different in the setting where the recommendation should be implemented from or then the guideline panel actually considered, and might that lead to a different decision? Or is there important variation in the availability of resources that might lead to a different decision? So a relatively brief checklist approach to support making decisions about whether or not a recommendation needs to be adapted with a response scale here. This also came in the context of the adaptive framework that many of you will be familiar with. This is a table summarizing the phases, the modules, and the actual steps in the adaptive manual that can be used to adapt guidelines to a specific context. 3 different phases: setup, adaptation, and finalization, with supported by detailed information about modules and steps that are described, as I said, in the adaptive manual and module that is a fairly precise approach to doing things. And much of that were starting points to the work that we did with the development frameworks. So to use guidelines in your context, think back to the cervical intraepithelial neoplasia recommendation that I just described. A guideline group or a receiving organization has essentially three ways of thinking about the individual recommendations. It can adopt the recommendation as is. So in the example that I described about cervical intraepithelial neoplasia, if LEAP is available and all of the other factors are right, a local or country-wide screening program may just say, this recommendation applies to us, and adopt the recommendation. It can adapt it to modify or fit the needs of the target population or target setting, or obviously a new recommendation can be created for a number of reasons that I will describe a little bit later. And a new recommendation may be actually one that a current guideline that an organization is looking at adopting or adapting may not include. And I will also provide you an example for that. And these new recommendations in the development framework would be based ideally on existing evidence summaries that either need to be updated or can be utilized. I thought to provide you with our view on the definition of adoption, adaptation, and new guideline preparation or new recommendation preparation. Adoption, in our view, is the use of an existing recommendation existing recommendations without modification of the original recommendation, and providing information on how to implement them in a setting, in the target setting, that may be different from what the original guideline developers intended. In the ideal case, this is based on a review and agreement with the judgments that influence the original recommendations. It requires agreement with the actual judgments that determine the direction and strength of the original recommendation, that is, the recommendation made by the original guideline developer. The choice of the guideline scope and the individual recommendations often follows, or typically follows, from the availability of existing recommendations. I will also speak about that process a bit more a little later. Finally, it is the cheapest and quickest way of developing a guideline. Adaptation involves identifying pertinent healthcare questions, searching for existing guidelines that address those questions and perform critical appraisal, and decide to accept or modify either whole guideline or specific recommendation by considering whether they are up to date, acceptable, and applicable given the cultural and organizational context. Adoption and adaptation serve two primary purposes. Very clear. It means that when resources are limited, which most guideline organizations are facing, you can build on existing efforts to provide local, regional, or national guidance. They serve the purpose of considering factors that are specific to the settings to enhance usability for the intended target groups. But using this approach, guideline developers must actually choose which specific recommendations to adapt. So the good news of using evidence to decision frameworks is that given the criteria, given what I described to you, they transparently lay out the judgments that a guideline panel makes when formulating recommendations, and that would facilitate their later adaptation or even adoption. The bad news is, based on the experience that we've collected, is that existing guidelines often do not provide the necessary details about the process and the other decisions that are really necessary to use the evidence to decision frameworks to adapt or adopt them. Finally, de novo guideline or recommendation development obviously relates to either new questions and seeking to answer them in a new guideline, or specific questions that were left unanswered in existing guidelines. And this should be really based on existing evidence syntheses such as systematic reviews or health technology assessments. The choice of the approach obviously is influenced by monetary and non-monetary resources, the credibility that comes with either adopting or adapting existing guidelines, as well as those of the creating organization, how uptake can be maximized, and how the benefits of sharing the information widely through further adaptation or adoption can be maximized. It leads to avoiding duplication of the efforts. Organizations obviously need to make a choice, what is the best approach, and they need to develop a detailed strategy and build capacity to do either adoption or adaptation. So I will now specifically refer to, over the next 15-20 minutes, to the example of the use of EtDs in this guideline development process. Once again, for those of you who have joined later, which stands for Adaptation, Adoption, and Development, or de novo creation of recommendations. In a nutshell, it starts with prioritizing questions, identifying and updating existing evidence syntheses, including systematic reviews, health technology assessments, or other evidence reports. It includes looking for existing systematic reviews or other evidence that is required to complete the entire evidence-to-decision framework, and then developing recommendations in a structured and transparent way for the healthcare setting. It is not simply adopting recommendations from previous guidelines, as I will explain. The example project that I will be using here, and I will specifically focus on 3 examples, one for adoption, one for adaptation, one for de novo guideline recommendation development, is based on guidelines from a guideline project that also led to capacity building on 22 clinical and public health topics. This project was conducted between June 2013 and June 2015, and it focused on development. It is also influenced, this work is also influenced, this just as a reference to you, by work that was done in the context of the World Health Organization, a review of a guideline development program that had many elements of adoption and de novo guideline development. You can Google that. It's a WHO document focusing on guideline development in Estonia, a review of a program. So, but returning to the example which I will use here, there were 3 main groups involved in this development effort. A group that guided the actual methods, a coordinating center, in this case in Saudi Arabia, that took over project coordination, recruited panel members, facilitated the communication with panel members, and helped with dissemination of the guideline, and then obviously a guideline panel members. These guideline panel members prioritized questions for guidelines. They were involved under additional considerations, for instance, to suggest local evidence, and provided input on local data, for instance, the baseline risk, which obviously was supported by systematic reviews that were done for these efforts, but sometimes studies are unpublished, and local guideline panel members can help identifying that information, reviewing evidence summaries, and then making judgments and formulating the actual recommendations and help with dissemination. So this is a busy slide that I will break up for you, but it summarizes the development process. On the left-hand side are the 3 main steps. This is a detailed algorithm for how a development would work for a guideline development context. So adoption, adaptation, and de novo development. The 3 steps are listed here. It begins by identifying and prioritizing existing guidelines or evidence synthesis of interest and relevance to a local guideline development group or a national guideline development group that is using information presented in other systematic reviews or guidelines. Second step involves evaluating and completing great evidence to decision frameworks for each of the recommendations that a guideline panel would want to make or an organization would want to make. And the third is this great development approach of recommendations in a guideline. Those are the three major or key steps that are involved in development. I will now break them up and make them a bit more visible, so this should be large enough to be seen on your screens if you sit in front of a computer like I do. And this is just, once again, an encouragement to type questions in the chat or ask questions as they actually come up. So, as I said, it begins by identifying guideline topics. So, for instance, by setting priorities in a country or in a specific setting, and then by identifying existing guidelines or evidence syntheses that might address these topics. It includes involving stakeholders to agree that guideline questions are actually relevant and will yield useful and trustworthy recommendations. So local input and buy-in is a very, very critical step in the adoption process. What I'm referring to is it is probably not helpful as a national organization to just go out, look at existing other guidelines, and start the process without involving the relevant stakeholders. This came out of the work that I just mentioned, the review of the Estonian healthcare program, but it comes out of much other work as well. And then it includes, as a second major step, develop the evidence to decision criteria, and making sure that existing guidelines provide information on these existing evidence to decision criteria. So what one would do on the basis of individual recommendations, not guidelines as a whole, one would check for transparent description of the criteria that determine an individual recommendation, including the evidence and the judgment that an existing guideline would have made. And ideally, if you think of it, complete evidence to decision frameworks would be already available. So with the further development and of guidelines that use complete evidence to decision frameworks, the adaptation, adoption, and de novo creation will obviously be facilitated. Either there is a complete evidence to decision framework that is available in an existing guideline, or a guideline developer would start completing one. In a following step, once these draft evidence to decision criteria are started to be created, then one would make decisions based on the following three scenarios. Either information about an EtD criteria is available, complete and up to date. Information on EtD criteria may be available, but may either be incomplete or outdated. So, for instance, you're interested in resource information, but that information is either outdated or not complete for your setting, or there's no or insufficient information about an EtD criterion, but useful elements could be included. So, for instance, you might identify a systematic review of the intervention effect that is relevant. I'm just skipping through because that is better visible. So following that evaluation, if information is indeed available and it's complete and up to date, a recommendation can be considered for adoption. If the information is available but incomplete or out to date, a recommendation becomes one that either needs to be adapted through information that is identified, or it may actually be leading to an entire new development of a recommendation. Finally, if there is no or insufficient information on EtD criteria, it typically leads to a new recommendation, new development of recommendation. And the way that we are imagining it and have applied it is actually by looking at making specific judgments. So, for instance, for adoption of an original recommendation, there would have to be agreement with the individual criteria and judgments that are included in an evidence to decision framework. If there is disagreement or changes required based on the local setting, so for instance, think back to the LEAP example, LEAP is not available, a recommendation needs to be adapted, and the alternative may be the appropriate way of proceeding. When the synthesized or described research evidence requires minor updates or there's missing information, that by default makes leads to adaptation of an original recommendation, although the strength and direction may be the same. And then, as I already described, there are many situations for when a new recommendation is required. So all of that can be done, as we said, in GRADE software, which is freely available for non-profit purposes. GradePro.org is the actual website. As I said, GradePro can be used to develop evidence to produce evidence to decision frameworks. Right there, they can be used for online interaction. So, for instance, I will take you through this. How can this adoption or adaptation process actually work? You can involve panel members by proposing judgments to vote on a specific assessment of the EtD frameworks once the information is compiled. So, as a quick example, what will be available in GradePro once these articles are published is following that. So, for instance, you might want to share the information with a guideline panel member and ask them to provide information that or additional information that is relevant, for instance, for research evidence. So there are common fields when you share this information that will help you determine whether or not a recommendation's evidence is complete or incomplete. Just making this a little bit larger, there are ways of asking panel members to make judgments beforehand, as we just said. If you wanted to share this information with others. And finally, you can use that information to see that just presume that a guideline developer has provided research evidence that you describe under research evidence with the judgments that a guideline developer has made. So, for instance, that the problem is a priority. A panel member, a local development may include agreeing or disagreeing with these judgments and providing the information for, in particular, disagreement transparently, so that recommendations for a local setting are transparently adapted or adopted. Okay, so as I said, that can be done in an interactive framework. I will give you a couple of examples now, take you through an example relatively quickly. So, for instance, in this adultment effort, one of the questions would have been whether or not home treatment versus hospital treatment should be used for patients with an acute DVT of the leg with anticoagulation. An evidence to and a summary of evidence, a summary of findings table would have been used that summarized the evidence for the intervention effect with information presented for individual outcomes, and the guideline panel, the local guideline panel for the adaptation or adoption situation would have reviewed that evidence and possibly altered specific judgments. If they altered judgments, it by default leads to adoption or recommendation. Just to explain this to you, this is our standard grade assessment. If you have a summary of findings table from an existing guideline with a quality of evidence rating, as a guideline panel that adopts or adapts a recommendation, you might want to review the decisions or the judgments that have been made by an existing guideline developer, for instance, with regard to application of evidence to a specific PICO question in your setting. That may lead to altering the certainty in the evidence, which in the case that I just presented was not the case, so that under those circumstances, the evidence to decision framework for that particular question that was produced didn't alter the overall certainty in the evidence. And the final product would then lead to a recommendation after going through all of the evidence to decision frameworks to a recommendation by a local panel. I will now take you through 3 examples that exemplify the development process. I will start, based on that project in Saudi Arabia that I just described, I will start with an example of adoption. And the specific issue deals with hemodialysis. And there are a number of lessons learned from that particular example. So as part of this development process, we identified a recommendation, a guideline by the Canadian Society of Nephrology. And the question here addressed whether or not patients with renal failure should undergo early versus later hemodialysis. That is, using early criteria of indication of renal failure, start hemodialysis early as opposed to using criteria and start it later. And it's an interesting example for a number of reasons. So the Canadian Society of Nephrology that developed these guidelines recommended what is called intent to defer over an intent to start early approach for the initiation of chronic hemodialysis or dialysis. And it did so based on a randomized controlled trial that was out there. This was summarized in an evidence, in a summary of findings table, as well as an evidence to decision framework. Now, this recommendation was reviewed by a panel in Saudi Arabia. And there were a few interesting things taking place. One is that when the panel actually met, it became obvious that there was a very strong opinion leader, a very well-known nephrologist in the room that had actually trained many of the others and many of the other panel members, and was a very, very strong personality. Luckily enough, we were working off evidence to decision frameworks in this particular context. And I will present an evidence to decision framework that was used at that time to make the process clear. But the issue was that panel members felt that because the opinion leader was a proponent of an intent to start early approach, it would be very, very difficult to not adopt this recommendation and deviate from what the original recommendation actually intended. So it would be very challenging because of the opinion leader in the room who was a strong proponent. Anyway, what happened is the panel lead, Reem Mustafa, a colleague of ours, who also participated in the original guidelines, luckily, was operating off a complete evidence to decision framework. So this would be the evidence to decision framework, as we said, clear question formulation, background information, criteria, judgments, research evidence, and additional considerations for all of the criteria, beginning with whether or not the problem is a priority. The guideline panel locally would add information as necessary. The guideline panel would work through the additional criteria, all of the criteria together in a meeting. Information was provided. So, for instance, that a systematic review that was existing was updated, that information that was locally relevant was considered, and the panel would work through the individual criteria that include the certainty in the evidence, issues around how much people value the main outcomes, and whether or not there's uncertainty around the values and preferences, whether or not the desirable anticipated health effects are substantial or large, whether or not the undesirable anticipated effects are small, and what the actual balance between the desirable and undesirable effects are. Panel would work through the judgments, the individual judgments that were made by the original panel, and saw whether or not they agreed with them. At the end, they ended up agreeing with the judgments that were made by the original panel, they figured that the undesirable consequences of starting early clearly outweigh the desirable consequences, and recommended against starting early. In other words, for intent to defer this recommendation, and provide a detailed justification that once again led to adopting the recommendation with information that would help locally with implementing the recommendation. This is used as an example for adoption, but it has a few key messages. One is that it would lead, and that it led to a complete practice change of authorities in the field. The opinion leader after the meeting stated clearly, we probably made mistakes by starting to treat patients early with hemodialysis, given the evidence that is out there, and it led to capacity building, and the evidence to decision frameworks helped, by laying out the criteria specifically, helped with even a simple adoption of the recommendation by making sure that everybody around the table actually understood reasons for the direction and strength of the recommendation. Okay, and we identified a number of other examples that are similar to what I described. I will provide a second example of, in this case, adaptation. Also here, our starting point was a existing Canadian guideline. This is just by chance that there were two Canadian guidelines, but they were well-done guidelines with some information that helped us to complete the evidence to decision framework. And that recommendation focused on breast cancer screening, published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, and the recommendation said for women 40 to 49 years of age, we recommend not routinely screening for breast cancer with mammography, with a weak recommendation based on moderate quality evidence. That recommendation underwent adaptation in the local context. I will describe what happened. The actual guideline panel in a different setting, once again, in the Saudi Arabian setting, suggested screening with mammography in these women. So in opposing recommendations, both of them conditional, one against, one for. Why did that happen? And why did this, how was this recommendation adapted? Two key areas, two key factors. So once again, we worked through a complete evidence to recommendation framework, what happened was the following. It was considered that based on local data, a registry, a higher baseline risk existed in Saudi Arabia for breast cancer in that particular age group of women who are 40 to 49 years old. And this is just to exemplify how the evidence to decision frameworks can be used, once again, under additional considerations. For instance, you might want to record the opinions of the individual panel members when you get to agreement on them. And this was done here. There was not complete agreement that, for instance, under those circumstances, the balance between benefits and harms is much closer balanced or more closely balanced than it is in the Canadian setting based on the higher baseline risk. And with this higher baseline risk, the panel, as I said, ended up making a recommendation that differed. So they ended up making a recommendation in favor and indicated as follows: based on local cancer registry data that were used for adaptation, which indicated that the incidence of breast cancer in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia seems to be higher than in other countries. A recommendation in favor was actually made. This, as a rationale, led to that a higher benefit on breast cancer mortality once again may justify a recommendation in favor. So an example of adaptation based on different baseline risks specified in the evidence to decision criteria. I will come to my final example before stopping and opening the session for questions and answers, and that is the development of a de novo recommendation. This is an example from cardiology, and it has to do with when there is an acute myocardial infarction, those who perform interventions should look at all the vessels that may be affected by calcification and conduct an intervention, for instance, stenting of all of the vessels, as opposed to just going to the target vessel that has caused the myocardial infarction. The big question in cardiology, and a NICE guideline panel addressed that particular question in July 2013 in a guideline that was published. And it is called here culprit, so for the vessel that causes the myocardial infarction, as opposed to complete revascularization. They found 2 randomized controlled trials that addressed outcomes that were important, such as all-cause mortality. And these 2 trials had only 218 individuals involved, only 10 events. The actual guideline, NICE guideline panel felt that they couldn't make a recommendation, despite the fact that the recommendation or the question was important. Now, in the development process that I described, we performed an update of the existing evidence, and lo and behold, we identified 2 new randomized controlled trials that had been published after the NICE guideline, very well done guideline, produced a statement that they couldn't make a recommendation. So 2 new trials identified that indicated, so don't get confused, it's the alternative way of showing the information, that indicated that if all vessels were dealt with at the time of the intervention, both long-term mortality was actually reduced, not statistically significantly, so there was issues around imprecision, as well as reinfarction was reduced when all vessels were dealt with at the same time. So in this particular instance, the difference was that an additional 800 patients had been included in new studies. A updated evidence profile, a summary of findings table was produced that now included 4 randomized controlled trials as opposed to the 2 randomized controlled trials that were there before. No recommendation was made in the NICE guidelines. The Saudi panel ended up making a recommendation that was weakly in favor of using the intervention mostly for issues around feasibility and acceptability. The Saudi Arabian panel, therefore, was more certain in the decision or recommendation, and it became a new recommendation on the basis of new evidence that was identified during the effort, as I said before. So I would summarize advantages and challenges for the way that we've described this, the use of evidence-to-decision frameworks for development. In the last case, an entirely new evidence-to-decision framework had to be created as opposed to the other cases where existing judgments were either confirmed or adapted. The advantages of development obviously are that it builds in part on existing evidence and syntheses, that it includes transparent considerations of criteria beyond the quality of evidence with a focus on local and regional settings. It helps building capacity by involving local panel members in the judgment phase and in the agreement or disagreement with judgments of other panels, and it is done by recommendation rather than by guideline. It allows guideline panels and those who set priorities to identify relevant questions. There are a number of challenges, and the challenges are that evidence syntheses are required as a starting point in order to perform updates of existing information. Often challenges that we have identified are when existing systematic reviews that focus on interventions, not on the other information, include only randomized controlled trials or highly selected outcomes. That typically leads to adaptation or de novo development of guidelines because the existing information is insufficient. It most of the time requires reviews or information about the other criteria that inform a recommendation. I mentioned before the criteria that are included in the evidence-to-decision framework are a long list. They go from priorities to the evidence about interventions or tests, to information about values and preferences, to information about the balance between benefits and harms that include a combination of obviously the desirable and undesirable health effects and the values that we place on them. 2, information about cost, how expensive or how costly is an information, are the interventions cost effective. Require information about the feasibility, acceptability, and equity considerations. All of that information needs to be available for an efficient adaptation or adoption process. Another challenge for development is that panels that you work with or the organizations that you work with need to commit to follow a rigorous methodological approach. Finally, how can development work? Obviously, it can work if we share information. So GRADE has now engaged in developing databases where these evidence-to-decision frameworks can be shared. So, for instance, searching for one of the new treatments for a WHO-recommended TB regimen would lead you to the actual recommendation that has been made, including summary of findings tables and complete evidence-to-decision frameworks that those who want to adapt or adopt recommendations or even develop new recommendations can use. So in conclusion, GRADE development combines the advantages of adoption, adaptation, and de novo recommendation. It focuses on guidelines per recommendation. Some recommendations will be adapted, others adopted, some need to be newly developed. GRADE EtDs are a core component of the approach with an increasing production of evidence-to-decision frameworks that include all the criteria. Adoption and adaptation will be facilitated, and EtDs in itself facilitate structured interaction and deliberation with panel members during the guideline panel meetings and can save important resources. Thank you very much. So we have time for questions and answers for at least another 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, your question and answer session continues. If you wish to ask a question, please key star, then 1 on your telephone, record your name, then press the hash key. If you then decide to withdraw your question, simply key star 2. All questions will be answered in the order received, and you will be advised when to ask your question. All other lines will remain on listen only. Alternatively, you may submit a question on the WebEx. To do this, please click on the Q&A tab indicated by a question mark sign, type your question, and click Send to all panelists. Just to remind you, if you wish to ask an audio question, please key star, then 1 on your telephone, record your name, and press the hash key.
I think there are a number of questions now that have been typed up.
Yes, we have some WebEx questions. The first one is from Jill Petrella. What is Epistemonikos?
Yeah, Epistemonikos is a online platform that supports that supported evidence-to-decision frameworks in the development phase of the DECIDE project. It offers what is also included in GRADE Pro and can be used as an online tool. GRADE Pro is a more complete offering that includes some evidence profiles and detailed assessments of the evidence, as well as some issues around conflict of interest management and so on. The Epistemonikos was the platform that was used to program, to do a lot of the programming work during the DECIDE project. Epistemonikos is also much more. I suggest that you Google it. It's headed by a group in Chile and is a very useful tool for evidence searching and assessing, in particular, evaluating information that has been summarized in systematic reviews. The second question is, what different types of stakeholder would you recommend including? Patients, reps too. It's an excellent question. There's obviously a lot of literature that is available around different stakeholders that should be included in the guideline panel. We find it extremely helpful, obviously, that those who are the actual implementers when you do a development should be part of guideline panels, so the clinicians actually using the recommendations. That creates, once again, ownership as well as support dissemination. So these are people who should certainly be considered as local stakeholders. I will cite or report from this Estonia guideline program review that we did, a country that is fairly small in terms of population, but has a very advanced healthcare system. It depended to a large degree on recommendations or guidelines that were developed by other groups. What was felt important when we did the research with representatives of the country was that they were involved in the actual development of or adaptation or adoption of the guidelines in order to be behind them and start implementing them. So getting those who use the recommendations in an development process to be part of the guideline groups that adopt seems to be a very important factor. Patient reps, our guidelines typically include patient representatives for a number of reasons. One is that it is extremely helpful to obviously have people involved who possibly take a layman's view or possibly those who can relate to certain conditions. Typically, patient representatives are included. The next question says, the evidence documentation for an existing guideline may not be parallel to the GRADE criteria, may be focused on effectiveness and risk benefits only. What's the recommended approach to identifying new evidence to address those criteria? It's an excellent question and absolutely true. In fact, that is one of the big limitations for adoption or adaptation of recommendations in general. The information that is provided in an existing guideline is simply insufficient to do either of them. As you saw from the type of algorithm that I produced there or that we produced there, it often or by default almost leads to developing new recommendations. But what is the recommended approach to identifying new evidence? So we encountered this in many of our guidelines that we developed. The way that we addressed it is we started with looking for systematic reviews that informed the individual criteria that were relevant for decision making. So focused on existing systematic reviews, for instance, about cost effectiveness, or even about values and preferences. However, in many situations or instances, that information is not available. You have a number of options there. You can clearly state that no research evidence was identified, in particular if you went further and looked for individual studies. For our efforts, we looked specifically for information when there were gaps. So for instance, values and preference information, so patient values and preference information was not available for many of the existing systematic reviews that we used to develop or guidelines that we used to develop. We went out, searched for that information down to the individual study type, and as part of the development, once again, it typically leads to adaptation or de novo creation of guidelines. I worked with the panel members to provide us with this evidence. It is very clear, very, very clear, that under those circumstances, you may end up with what could be biased evidence because those who identify the evidence will send you or will provide you with information that they are aware of and not all of what is out there. But the benefit of using the criteria and using the evidence to decision frameworks is that you can be transparent about it. That type of information may be included under any additional considerations, and judgments can be made on those. The other benefit is that at the end, when you decide about the recommendation, all of the panel members will look at the same type of information. Next question, and those questions that I answer, if you can provide information, if you can type some additional comments. If I didn't answer your question sufficiently, then please do that. The next question is from Reinhard Holm. In a case of adaptation, do I have to make an actualization of the old review, or can I modify the existing review? Okay, it's a good question. So this would be part of your guideline manual, obviously, of your approach that you would be choosing as a guideline organization. So, for instance, in a recent guideline effort where we adapted recommendations, we would set a cutoff for what information we would consider as up to date. In the case that systematic reviews were not available that would fulfill this cutoff for date, we would update the existing review. That obviously is only possible if search strategies are available, but if these search strategies are available, it can be done, and we've done this repeatedly. If they are not available, then you create additional challenges, and the most important thing is here to just be transparent. So if, for instance, you have an existing review that addresses the relevant outcomes, but you can't get your hands on the search strategy and so on, then be transparent and say, you know, we updated this review developing our own search strategy. That helps, and that's one of the other big benefits of the evidence to decision framework. That helps with further updates down the line, in particular if you then get a hold of the search strategy. Once again, so the brief answer is it depends a little bit on where you set your cutoffs. You may be accepting older reviews in areas where research is not developing as fast. In areas, I mentioned one of the examples, the cardiology example, culprit vessel angioplasty, in areas where the evidence is developing fast, we updated the review. Okay, there are two comments. One, my compliments, thank you very much. The next comment is the framework already available? The paper that I described here, the development framework, is currently under review and will be published hopefully soon. The evidence to decision frameworks are also in press currently. A general description of the evidence to decision frameworks, as well as a clinical example and an example for tests. The test example is available as a preprint, and you can you can PubMed that, use PubMed to identify that particular framework. How can these tables be used for assessing complex comparative effectiveness reviews? Do you have any examples? I think this is so yes, we have examples. They can be used in similar ways where obviously the intervention becomes that might be providing the greatest net benefit. So for instance, if you have 4 treatments that may be of relevance for consideration, typically what obviously happens in a complex, in a comparative effectiveness review is that one or the other intervention becomes, appears to be the most effective one, and under those circumstances that would be reviewed. Do we have some examples of it? One example that I'm aware of is a comparison of 6 different strategies for screening and treating cervical intraepithelial neoplasia. So related to the examples that I described, were 6 different approaches where compared. That typically involves modeling, because the issues around multiple treatment comparisons become more complex. You're dealing with not only health benefits and harms, but also different cost effectiveness. Next question, Pablo Alonso, regarding the certainty of research use, do we have to focus on the results of the sensitivity analysis of economic evaluations? There are other sources of information for this part of the, are there other sources of information for this part of the EtD framework? So we are currently working, GRADE is currently suggesting that you use your own economic evaluations and assess the certainty in the evidence based on the paper that we published in the BMJ. There is current evaluation of developing that framework further for how we can evaluate existing economic evaluations and provide information about the certainty of the evidence. Zachary Munn, can you provide definitions for feasibility, accessibility, and equity, how these interrelate in more detail and how they need to be considered in development? Zach, I will refer you to the definitions that are part of the evidence decision framework, can be both obtained through GRADE Pro as well as Epistemonicus. There is detailed instructions for how they are used. I will also be happy to provide a series of examples for how feasibility, accessibility, and equity has influenced the information. I suggest that we, as a follow-up, share the guidelines that were produced in Saudi Arabia. They are freely available on the web, I might as well type an answer right now. I think we can probably do this in just a nutshell. The next question deals with whether or not this approach is reproducible. And in terms of reproducibility, GRADE has always taken the approach that reproducibility is less of a concern. The main issue that we are dealing with is transparency, and the transparency is key. We don't have information on reproducibility, but that can be obtained later. Final two questions. Thank you for the presentation. To what extent is there a need of adapting EtDs to use them in HTA? We believe that it's probably the other way around. Health technology assessment informs recommendations, and you would, of course, you could use information from the EtDs to inform a certain health technology assessment, but the EtDs are really more complete by considering factors that go beyond health technology assessment. Once again, just to provide a short answer, you can use existing information in EtDs to have them flow into a health technology assessment, but typically it's the other way around because of issues around accessibility and feasibility and so on. So that development on the basis of existing health technology assessments, which may provide additional information than a systematic review of an intervention, can be used in development. And then Helen, yes, was concerned about confirmation bias when searching for new evidence. Completely agree. It's an issue that is relevant there. I will send the information to chat about the existing guidelines to everyone. And so that should be appearing in the chat. So you can click on that link and you will see the 22 guidelines that have been published with all with completed evidence to decision frameworks, specifically responding to Zach Munn about examples for feasibility, acceptability, and equity considerations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. ladies and gentlemen, that concludes your conference call for today. You may now disconnect. Thank you for joining and have a very good day.